so we can, I don't know what that was, wrap up before we take too long. So we're going to go over Chapter 4 and the fire code today. Chapter 4 talks about emergency planning and preparedness. So when we look at, if I can get my computer to work. Can you guys all see the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we look at Chapter 4. It's a little bit different than a lot of the other chapters in the fire code, and then a lot of the chapters in the building code. So Chapter 4, the majority of the fire code deals with building construction, fire protection systems, basically things that we're going to put inside of a building to minimize the risk, reduce damage, things like that, contain fires before they progress, or try to keep them from progressing. Chapter 4 is a little bit different because we're looking at basically human actions and what's required of the people inside the buildings, not necessarily the buildings themselves. So a lot of the requirements in Chapter 4, I'll say, are a little more complicated to enforce because you're dealing with people, and people can sometimes be a pain in the butt to deal with. So keep that in mind, as we go through and look at some of the stuff that's required of the businesses. Some businesses are really good at doing what they're supposed to do. I'll use Edgewater as an example. They're regulated by so many different agencies, and they have all their plans in place. They're really good at what they're supposed to be doing. If you look at some of the emergency planning requirements for, say, your typical restaurant or bar, they're going to be a little more lacking just because of their operation. They have staff and personnel that pretty much rotates on a constant basis. And it's harder to keep up with, keeping the people trained and making sure they know what's going on. So as we go into this, just keep that stuff in mind. So looking at the scope for Chapter 4, just some of the stuff from the code. Basically, we're looking at how emergencies are reported, how fire incidents are reported, coordination between the businesses and the fire department, so what the businesses need to provide so that we're able to do our job. And then looking at procedures for managing or responding to the emergencies so that the people in the businesses react appropriately and do what they're supposed to do before we get there. We're going to talk about emergency plans, fire safety plans, as we go through this briefly. So emergency plans, the fire code talks about when they should be implemented. The emergency plan gets implemented, oddly enough, when there's an emergency. So if you have an unwanted fire in a building, the fire alarm activates. Any other emergency in the building, that's when the emergency plan kicks in. So it's some of this stuff's pretty straightforward, but. So toward the end, we're going to talk about schools and not only schools, but just required safety drills, fire evacuation drills, and things like that. Something that happens a lot, especially with schools, is they're required to have so many fire drills every year. They're always looking for a substitute for their required fire drills so they don't have to disrupt their day. So a lot of times I've had schools ask, like, well, Bobby just pulled the fire alarm and we evacuated the building. We can count that as one of our drills. So the fire code actually speaks to that specifically. So, it doesn't count as one of your drills. If somebody accidentally pulls the fire alarm, that doesn't count. So as we go through, keep that in mind. It's a question that I get a lot at schools. Those are some definitions. These, again, it's kind of like when the drill is implemented. They're pretty straightforward. Emergency evacuation drill, basically using it to train staff and the occupants and then see how they do with the evacuation and responding to the emergencies. So we're looking at fire drills, rapid dismissals. We're going to talk, actually the next definition is lockdowns. That's covered in this section. So lockdowns, it's an emergency situation, and other than a group I3 occupancy. Does anybody remember we talked, if you guys were here last training, what an I3 occupancy is? An I occupancy is institutional. What'd you say? Virus? No. So jails, places where people are incarcerated. So obviously they're locked down all the time. So the lockdown drills don't necessarily kick in there. But so lockdown drills, basically we're looking at sheltering in place when we don't want to evacuate occupants. So active shooter, active threat incidents, things like that. A lot of that language is new in the last few years in the fire code, just because it's the world we live in today. So schools are required to maintain that. So we'll talk about lockdowns a little bit later when we talk about required drills and frequency and stuff like that.
When are the killer hornets going to?
And then the only other definition is smoke detectors. I think that's self-explanatory. I don't think I need to explain what a smoke detector is to you guys. So the fire code in chapter 4 actually gives us a lot of I don't want to say leeway, but a lot of authority in requiring things be done ahead of time. We are allowed to require building owners, business owners, planners, people who are planning events and things like that, allows us to require them to put plans in place and take steps to reduce the impact on our operations and to plan for the safety of the people. So when we look at public assemblies and large events, there's a lot of language in there that talks about what can be required. Fire codes, or fire watches, the fire code gives us to put fire watches in place. When do you think the fire code official, and remember when we talk about code official, any of you that have the fire inspector card, you're considered a code official when we're talking about this stuff. So when would you think you're able to put a fire watch in place?
Anytime you feel deemed necessary.
So RC said anytime you feel it's necessary. So when, in your opinion, it's essential for the safety of the people there. So whether it's the number of people there, whether it's the nature of the event, the contest, whatever it is, basically you can require the organizer, the manager, the business owner, put fire watch personnel in place as you require them. So you can choose how they need to operate. You can choose how many they need to have. You can tell them, what you want them to do essentially in that case, which gives us a lot of leeway. So hopefully when we go through some of these events, a lot of this has been pre-planned. Some of this language is, if you walk into a situation. So I know that I've heard stories about a couple establishments in town that may have bike nights and stuff like that are card contests, raffle contests, whatever, that have more people than you think they should in place, and thinking about the disruption that you would cause trying to kick 200 people out of a place because they have too many people and you're trying to figure out, who can stay, who can go, things like that. This is another option that we have to be able to require them to take some additional steps and have some extra people in place just for that event to make sure we get through the event. Obviously, after that happens, then myself or we would want to have a conversation with the business owner if we don't want it to happen in the future. But this gives us the ability to kind of, in some of those emergent situations, to require them to do things, and the fire code tells us we can do that. So we talk about public safety plans, a little bit different than a fire watch. Public safety plans are typically things that we're going to put together ahead of time. So if you think about the larger events, Rock the Clock, or the fireworks, things like that, we have the ability to require a public safety plan be developed. So basically, we're looking at an indoor or outdoor gathering. So, it could be an indoor event at the high school. It could be, basically, again, it's up to our determination, has an adverse impact on public safety. When we talk about adverse impacts on public safety, we're looking at things like diminished access to buildings and structures. So again, you think about the large festivals and events downtown, we're blocking off streets, we're reducing access to buildings, blocking access to fire hydrants, fire apparatus access. So, if it's, even in parking lots and things like that, not necessarily in the street, limited access for fire apparatus, and really any other adverse impact that you could identify based on that event, gives us the ability to require them to put a plan together to address whatever issues we identify. So when we look at those public safety plans, we're looking at adding information. If you think about the list of what would require a public safety plan, that's going to kind of answer what should be included in a public safety plan. And just keep in mind that all this stuff is not required for every single plan. So, just whatever's applicable to the situation that you're in. So, if we have diminished access to the building or buildings, what vehicle ingress and egress, not only diminished access to buildings, but if you think of things from an EMS standpoint, from large festivals and things, if we designate, one end of the street to be our typical means of ingress into the festival or fair, and we're going to go through and this is going to be our way out, we can put those plans in place ahead of time, and this gives us the ability to do that. So think about things like vehicle ingress and egress, how we're going to get in, how we're going to get out. Fire protection. So, think about blocked fire hydrants. Typically, we're going to work with the organizers and the planners to minimize or eliminate any obstruction of fire hydrants and things like that. But, as well as I do that when the carnies or the food truck people come in, they're going to put their trailer where they want to put their trailer. And sometimes everything gets set up, before, without us knowing sometimes. So keep that in mind. So thinking about fire protection issues and things that need to be addressed. Emergency egress or escape routes. So when you think of large outdoor events, I know like St. Patty's Day in Dayton was always a big deal because they ticket people coming into the event. So they have barricades, 6-foot chain link fence panels that they put up and block off the whole Oregon district. So you have to have a ticket to get in. We have to think about how those people are going to get out and the escape routes on a much larger scale. So luckily, a lot of the events that we've had here, we don't necessarily have to think about obstructions to egress, especially outside. But that's something that, if they're planning a ticketed event, like you have to pay to get into this event at the park and we're going to block off who can come in and who can go out, we have to plan for enough egress to get them out if there's an emergency. EMS. So again, in the public safety plan, if we determine that it's going to have an adverse impact on our operations, so the number of people we anticipate needing extra staffing, we can require, I know that historically we've kind of provided that to a lot of the events just as a service that the fire district kind of offers. But, we have the ability to mandate additional staffing and also require that the event organizer has to pay for that staffing. So that's covered in this as well. Public assembly areas, so locations where people can go. Again, if you think about large scale events, if we evacuate all the people, we evacuate them away from their vehicles and we're not going to have them leaving, where can we put them while we figure out what's going on? So alternate public assembly areas where we're going to put people, things like that. Think about how, people are coming into the event, where vehicles park, making the event organizers have something in place where, it includes a parking plan. It sounds kind of silly or simple, but if you have, 1,000 people coming to an event and in the middle of downtown, where are all people going to park? And a lot of your obstruction issues aren't necessarily going to be caused by the event if we've done the planning the right way, but they may be caused by the people who are parking and trying to get to the event. So making sure that there's a plan in place to address that. Briefly talked about food trucks, so vendors and food concession distribution, making sure that, you know, they're all going to try to compete for what they would consider the best place or the best location for the event, but making sure that they're distributed properly, there's a plan in place, and all that's laid out ahead of time. And then the last thing is, you know, I talked about EMS, but need for police, fire, or EMS personnel. You know, the fire code gives us the ability to require them have additional staffing that's at the level we require if we deem it necessary. So all this stuff should be done, you know, this public safety plan is done ahead of time. So this is not something that we go to the event on a Saturday and say, okay, well, we're going to do this, 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 and this. This is done, you know, ahead of time. You know, from the village's standpoint, typically the larger events we get involved in ahead of time, so we can go have a meeting with the public works, with the village, Ryan and his crew, the police chief, myself, or Chief Kidd. You know, somebody from each of those groups is typically there to meet with the organizer to talk about these things ahead of time.
Ryan?
Yeah.
Is there anything like a formula or anything that would dictate to say, hey, here's how many EMS personnel you might need, medical personnel you might need, or anything like that?
So there's not really the number of personnel you need. There is some, and I'm going to talk about in a second. We talk about crowd managers and things like that. That doesn't necessarily have to be fire department staff, police department staff. There's numbers for that. But not, I mean, it's going to be a lot based on historical experience and what you've experienced in the past. You know, take Rock the Clock as an example. What's our typical experience with that event? How many people? And, you know, last year, I think we had an extra duty medic crew down there with 3 of us for the event, and then the normal staffing, and that went, you know, that went fine. So a lot of the stuff is going to be kind of historical experience. And if you have a much larger event, you know, I was worried, they were talking about the fireworks for July the 4th and whether or not, you know, the village was going to do fireworks on July the 4th. And as we drew closer to that time before they said, we're going to move it to Labor Day, I was worried about what that would look like for the village, because we would be one of the few around Columbus that was going to have fireworks for the 4th of July. Well, people are going to want to go, you know, try to find a place to watch fireworks. That would be something that we would have to plan out and think about, because it's not a typical activity or a typical event. And some of these events, you know, the larger events, I mean, if we overshoot it a little bit, we'll learn for next time. A lot of them also kind of travel. So, I mean, we can get in touch with, you know, another jurisdiction that has had something similar and ask them what they did, what their experience was. So we talk about crowd managers. Like I told RC, you know, the crowd managers aren't necessarily fire department staff, police department staff, you know, any government entity. But crowd managers are required anytime you have an event where more than 1,000 people congregate. That's indoors or outdoors. And then there's the ratio of basically one crowd manager for every 250 people. So once you hit 1,000, at 1,000, you would have to have 4 crowd managers. And then for every 250 people that you anticipate, you would have another crowd manager. And a lot of these requirements kind of come back to events in the past, just like everything else in the fire code. It's all based on something that's happened historically. You know, when you look at, you know, some of the different events, the larger festivals and fairs and stage collapses and things like that, where you have, you know, hundreds and thousands of people and you don't have enough people to kind of help direct them and what they should do, that's where a lot of these requirements come from. So at 1,000 people, you got to have crowd managers. At that point, it's 1 for every 250 people. Unless you're indoors, the fire code gives us the ability to reduce that ratio, increase that ratio, whatever you want to call it, but go over that 250 people per crowd manager if it has a sprinkler system, or based on the nature of the event. So, we had a lot of, one thing in particular that I can think of was a amateur wrestling place in Dayton that they would have events all the time on a regular basis with, a large amount of people. They're getting toward the 1,000 people once they move outside with these amateur wrestlers, which was fun to watch. But anyways, but if I'm trying to figure out whether or not I need 1 crowd manager for 250 people, and I'm comparing, an amateur wrestling competition to, a Baptist church event that's going to have 1,000 people, I may look at those differently and say, yeah, you don't have to necessarily do this. Or, if you have 1 or 2 people for your 1,000-person event, that's going to be enough. I may, consider that amateur wrestling a little bit differently. So we have the ability to do that too. So we look at, I often ask people if they know what the NFPA standard for training of crowd managers is. I'm always surprised because NFPA has a standard for everything. NFPA doesn't have there is no standardized training or requirements for crowd managers. Basically, there are several programs out there. There's a couple listed there on the slide. They're typically 2 to 6 hours of online training, and then some of them, have venue-specific familiarization. So the UD Arena was one that we dealt with a lot. Every employee at UD Arena had to go through a trained crowd manager program. And it was actually the last one there on the slide, the trainedcrowdmanager.com. It was like 6 hours of online learning. And then they actually did a large scale event at the arena with all the staff, all the ushers, all the maintenance people that had to go through an emergency evacuation drill and everything as part of their program. So just keep in mind when we talk about crowd managers, the training for them could be something as simple as one of our staff, myself, or one of you, basically giving them an overview of what we expect of them. So, and their role as a crowd manager is to basically tell people, direct people on what to do when there's an emergency. So they can have alternate duties. A janitor could be one of the trained crowd managers that's on site and kind of moving around the building. And then if something happens, his role transitions into, facilitating the evacuation of the people in the building. We're going to talk a little bit quickly about fire safety and evacuation plans. Again, it's like everything else in the fire code. When they're required is all driven by what you're doing in the building. So it's kind of a busy slide, but just talking about when those requirements kick in. So like assembly occupancies, group A's, any assembly occupancy is required to have a fire safety and evacuation plan, unless, again, there's an exception for religious worship occupancies under 2,000 people. So if I have a bar with 51 people, I have to have a fire safety and evacuation plan. If I have a church with 2,000 people, I do not have to have a fire safety and evacuation plan. So it's kind of funny how some of the exceptions work in the code, but that's the lobbying. So, a lot of the exceptions in the code come from, the lobbying for different things, and it also comes down to what you're doing in that space. So, again, you wouldn't necessarily typically compare the crowd in a bar at 2 o'clock in the morning to a church service at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. So it's a different crowd and different requirements. But so any Group A, Group B, which are business offices, business office buildings. So if you have more than 500 people in one building or 100 people above or below the exit discharge, so anything beyond the first floor or under the first floor. Group E's, which is all schools. Group F, again, that 500, 100. Group H, which are the high hazard use groups. So they're in a separate classification themselves. They're required to have them. Institutional occupancies, all of them are required to have it. Again, if we think about institutional occupancies, those are the ones where people can't take care of themselves at some level, whether they're incarcerated, whether it's medical related, things like that. Mercantile is the same, 500 and 100. The residential, remember R1s are hotels, motels, stuff like that. R2s, you're looking at college and university apartment buildings and whatnot. High-rise buildings, covered malls exceeding 50,000 square feet, underground buildings, and then any building that has an atrium. So we talk about fire safety and evacuation plans. The fire evacuation plan, and these are different but similar. So you have a fire evacuation plan, you have a fire safety plan, and then if it's applicable, you have a lockdown plan. When we look at the plans, how often they should be reviewed and updated, basically annually. The plans need to be updated. If we have any changes in staff assignments or the people that are required to do something in that plan, if anything changes, the occupancy changes or the physical arrangement of the building changes. If we change how things are laid out, then that's going to affect these plans. And then the biggest thing that most people don't understand is who gets a copy of these plans. Everyone that is working in the building should have a copy of the fire safety, the fire evacuation plan, and it should be done ahead of time. These aren't necessarily documents that are supposed to be created and put in a 3-ring binder and then hung by the door so that when the fire alarm goes off, you pull the binder out and start flipping through pages and figure out what you're supposed to do. The intent is that these get distributed to the people in the building, the occupants of the building. They get some level of training depending on the occupancy type, and they know what they're supposed to do before the event occurs. So we look at fire evacuation plans. We're looking at things like egress and escape routes, whether the evacuation needs to be complete or only certain areas. If you think of certain hospitals and different types of buildings, it may be more appropriate to just evacuate a certain area of people. Fire alarm systems are designed the same way. High-rise buildings, a lot of times, if there's only one device that activates in a fire alarm in a high-rise building, it's typically the floor that the alarm goes off, and then the floor above and the floor below. And the rest of the building may have no idea that the fire alarm's going off. Once maybe another device gets activated, a second pull station, a second smoke alarm, things like that, then that may make the entire building's fire alarm go off. But so the purpose of the evacuation plan is to figure out what we're going to do ahead of time. Are we getting everybody out of the building? Are we only evacuating half the building? Are we sheltering people in place? Looking at things like people who have to stay in the building and operate critical equipment. Look at elevators. So if there's elevators that are installed in the building, as part of the means of egress. So again, thinking about hospitals, nursing homes, things like that may have elevators. Identifying who's using the elevators, who's responsible for operating the elevators, looking for identifying or the procedures for assisting the rescue of people who are unable to save themselves. So again, looking at nursing homes, daycares, stuff like that. Also looking at, once we get outside, a process for accounting for the people after you get outside. So both employees and occupants having a plan in place so that you know what to do. Fire evacuation plan, the preferred and alternate methods for notifying occupants. So, most buildings, it's going to be activate the fire alarm. But if the building doesn't have a fire alarm, is there an intercom system? Do they have some type of horn? Is there something that, is what's the preferred method to alert people? The preferred method for reporting fires, because, you know, this section of the fire code requires that people report all fires to the fire department. They have to call 911. So what's the preferred method for doing that? You know, do they use a landline? Do they use a cell phone? You know, what are they, you know, what is the preferred method? Identification of people who have additional information. If, you know, if you're at a building at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, having people that know that Bob is the guy, the maintenance guy that has all the information on everything mechanical in this building, you know, would be something that would be in this plan. And then finally, a description of the emergency system, the alert tone, and any of the pre-programmed voice messages. So a lot of the new systems don't just have the beeping sound, the alert sound, but they are followed by a voice message that says, you know, a fire alarm has been detected in the building. Please proceed to the nearest, that kind of thing. So a description of what those things look like. One of the funniest things I think that well, it's probably not one of the funniest things I've seen, but related to this topic, I had to laugh. Was at one of the union things in DC one year, and one evening as we're waiting to go out, I'm standing at the elevators and reading the sign because I was bored. But if you look at the bottom right part of the language there, it says the fire alarm sounds like a whoop whoop and looks like a strobe. I just thought that was funny. That's a pretty clear description of what the fire alarm sounds like in the building. So anyways, for what it's worth. So that's your fire evacuation plan. Fire safety plans. Again, we're looking at what's the procedure for reporting a fire or other emergency. If the building has a fire alarm, then that procedure should be activate the fire alarm, evacuate the building, you know, those kind of things. If we don't have a fire alarm, then that procedure may be evacuate the building once everyone's outside, use a cell phone, call 911, that kind of thing. The life safety strategy. So, you know, how are we evacuating people? Where are we evacuating people? You know, kind of identifying what the purpose and intent is when the alarm sounds. Site plans. So basically laying out, you know, once all the occupants evacuate, where they're going to go. For us, locations of fire hydrants on the property, and looking at normal routes of fire department vehicle access. That's important, and having a conversation with the people, because we don't want them to put their occupancy, their assembly point for all the people that evacuate in the middle of where we're going to try to pull and position a ladder, or, you know, where the engine's going to go to hit the FDC. So, you know, we want this stuff identified ahead of time. Floor plans for the building, so where their exits are, where their primary and secondary egress routes are, if there's any accessible means of egress, as far as people with disabilities. Are there any refuge areas? So again, larger buildings, sometimes schools, you know, once you go outside or maybe into the stairwell, there's an area of refuge where there's kind of a platform where people can go and escape and basically wait for somebody to come help them. Where their fire alarm boxes are, where their fire extinguishers are. If they have occupant hose stations, a lot of those are going to the wayside and aren't required a lot anymore, but some of the older buildings still have the occupant hose stations. And then where any of the fire alarm enunciators and fire alarm controls are. Fire safety plan also should have a list of any of the major fire hazards associated with that business, that building, including maintenance and housekeeping procedures. So not necessarily a big deal in a business office. Again, remember, when we go through this list, you know, there's, you know, a list of 10 items or 15 items. When they make their fire safety plan, they're only going to address the issues that are pertinent to them. So if I have a business office that, you know, may require a fire safety plan, there's probably not going to be a list of major fire hazards associated with the normal operation of that business. If I have a high hazard occupancy, or a flammable liquid production facility or storage facility, I'm probably going to have a list of, you know, what are the major hazards associated with this building. So, those things would be included. Who's responsible for the maintenance in the building, the sprinkler system, the fire alarm system, who maintains that, or who at least is the person responsible for ensuring that it's maintained and up to date. And then the same thing, identification and assignment of the people who are responsible for fuel hazard sources. So again, all of these aren't going to be applicable to every single business. So if it's applicable, there should be a person identified for that. Then lockdown plans, basically how the plan gets initiated. How do you report an emergency that requires a lockdown? There's language in the code. You can't use the fire alarm to notify people in a building of a lockdown emergency. There has to be some alternative for initiating that lockdown. So what is it? How do we account for the people that are there or aren't there, right? So we want to make sure that we know who's in the area, and we have some accountability for the people that should be there and whether or not they're present or accounted for. Recall, so the plan has to have a signal for returning to normal. So again, you have to have an initiation process and something that's separate from the fire alarm. You also have to have some way, a prearranged signal for how do we go back to normal? How do we stop the lockdown process? And then an approved method of communication and coordination. So what types of two-way communication do we have between a central location and then each secured area? So in theory, with these lockdown plans, if you think of a school, if they have a lockdown plan where the kids and the teachers are securing themselves in each classroom, there should be a plan and a method to communicate, two ways between some central location and each of those classrooms. So whether that's, two-way radios, whether that's an intercom system in the school, it just needs to be identified and planned for in that lockdown plan. When we talk about drills, frequency, again, it's driven by what type of occupancy you have, and that dictates how often you have to do it, and then who has to participate in the evacuation drill. So, your assembly occupancies, they're required to do them quarterly, and it's just the employees that are doing the evacuation drill. If I have a business occupancy that requires those evacuation drills, I have to do one a year, but everybody in the building has to evacuate and participate in the process. So you can see the chart there and the requirements for each of the different use groups. And then obviously as you get to the more high hazard use groups, right, assemblies are quarterly, a lot of the other ones are annually. You get down to the institutional and some of the residential ones, they're semi-annually or quarterly or even monthly on each shift. So all those are driven by, and basically this is why, right? This is why we do fire drills. You have your expectation and then you have reality and what people are going to do. So that's why we do the drills. Chapter 4 also talks about employee training. So employee training should be completed as part of the new employee orientation, and then annually thereafter, for your employees. You're looking at things like fire prevention training, fire extinguisher use, evacuation training, where the exits are, where the assembly point is, where the fire extinguishers are located, things like that. Emergency lockdown training, if they have a policy in place where they have lockdowns as part of their day-to-day operation, then training on how that process works. And then just general fire safety training on how to prevent fires from occurring in the first place. Hazard communication, so when we think of chemicals and chemical storage inside buildings, the Chapter 4 kind of outlines requirements for what has to happen. So SDS sheets for all hazardous materials have to be available. Basically all the containers have to be labeled and marked in accordance with federal regulations, as well as the room. So if you have a chemical storage room, the outside of that room should be marked or labeled in some way. in accordance with NFPA. People who are responsible should know what the materials are, what the nature of the materials are, and what they do. I can remember a couple of circumstances at Wright State when I was at Fairborn and University of Dayton. Colleges are I won't say terrible, but they have a lot of stuff going on, and they have a lot of stuff there with all the research and whatnot. You want to look for the people that have familiarity with the material that's being used. And sometimes there's some crazy stuff that can be in places, so it's important to find those people and know what you need to do. Depending on what's being stored, quantities of what's being stored, and how it's being stored or used, there's the ability to require a hazmat inventory statement and a hazmat management plan. I'm not going to go into those too much, but basically in later chapters in the fire code, it tells you what has to be if you have a hazmat inventory statement, if you're requiring that, what has to be included, and there's a large checklist. Same thing with a hazmat management plan, a large checklist. And then the last thing there is to terminate storage, there needs to be a closure plan submitted. So, not only are we're going to stop storing this stuff, but where are we taking the stuff that we're currently storing? We're not dumping it down the toilet or, wherever some people may choose to get rid of their materials. There needs to be a plan in place to terminate that storage. So we can require that as well. We look at just a few of the special requirements separated by use. We look at occupancies, again, where people eat, drink, movie theaters, nightclubs, sports arenas, things like that. When you think about your typical restaurant, nightclub, bar, there's requirements for them to provide a detailed seating plan, their occupant load, and their occupant load limit. Again, their seating plan so that we can see and make sure that they're operating the way that they normally should, how the tables and chairs are set up so that they maintain exit ways, aisle ways, and stuff like that. And theaters, motion picture theaters, auditoriums, and similar Group A uses, the announcement made at the beginning. Everybody's been to the movies. If you've ever been to a play, they always do the thing at the beginning, identifying the location of all the exits. With movie theaters, they have the ability, they can include that in just the beginning of the movie, which again, anybody that's been to a movie, they've seen the familiarize yourself with your nearest exit and the announcement that goes at the beginning. Some of the other live performances and different auditoriums and whatnot, typically somebody gets up and makes an announcement at the beginning before things start. We talked about educational occupancies and R2 residential occupancies and the fire drills. The first drill has to be completed within 10 days of class starting. So that's, in the fire code, school year starts, they have to do their first drill within 10 days. And then there's requirements for the drills thereafter. Talks about inclement weather. So again, with schools, making sure that they understand that the fire drills, the purpose of the drills, they're not to be necessarily planned. If you're going to plan them, there should be a limited number of people that are aware of the planning and when it's going to happen. They should hold drills at all times. So even if there's some inclement weather, obviously, if there's a severe thunderstorm or a downpour or, a blizzard, that's not the inclement weather we're talking about. But if it's cold outside and it's 20 degrees, we're still going to do our drills in schools, and that's required. Also alternating the time of day. So making sure that, we don't know that every Thursday, the second Thursday of every month at 10:30 is when we do our fire drill. That's not the idea of the drills. It's, really it should be varied and alternating the time of day. Again, you shouldn't have people look out and say, oh, it's going to rain today, so we definitely won't, or we're not going to do our drill today. That's where the inclement weather piece comes in. And then assembly points, making sure that in e-occupancies, they have those assembly points identified so that we know where everybody's going and everybody can account for themselves when we get there. H5 occupancies, there's, again, I'm not going to get into real detail on these, but plans and diagrams for the operations inside the H5 occupancy, where the equipment's at, diagrams for any of the operations that are going on, whether or not, their emergency response team, what the process is for them, how many, who are the people on that response team, and what their responsibilities are needs to be outlined. And special requirements for their emergency drills, again, just based on their occupancy. I-1 occupancies, staff training reviewed every 2 months. That's different than some of the other occupancies. Any of the residents that are able to self-evacuate should be trained. So again, you have some in I-1 occupancies that can't necessarily evacuate, but if you can, if they're able to, they need the training as well. Drills at least 6 times a year, 2 times a shift. And we're actually looking at I-1s to evacuate residents to a selected, they're actually evacuating from the building. So now my computer locked up. For I-2s, movement of patients to safe areas or outside is not required during the drills. And you can have you don't have to do the fire alarm activation to start the drill. That would typically be something you do in all the fire drills, but for I-2s, after hours, you can do some type of coded announcement where employees are notified of the drill, and they go through the process just to reduce the stress and things on the patients and the I-2 occupancies. For I-3s, employees get instructed on how to use fire extinguishers and any other manual fire suppression equipment. Generally speaking, it's going to be fire extinguishers. Has to be staffed 24 hours, and I-3, there has to be someone there because people are incarcerated. They're locked into where they're going to be. And keys for unlocking doors and the means of egress in an I-3 has to be identifiable by touch and sight. So if you have no light, you should be able to touch the keys and figure out which ones get you through those doors. So if you think of, some of the keys in jails and whatnot, I mean, they're easily distinguishable, and you can figure out how to use them. Whether there's no light, you should be able to touch them and figure out which one is which. R1s, again, we're looking at hotels, motels, stuff like that, evacuation diagrams. If you think of the little thing I showed you by the elevators at the one hotel, I mean, it had the floor plan, the evacuation diagram right there by the elevator with the whoop whoop for the fire alarm. Any emergency duties for the staff inside an R1, the desk, the front desk staff or maintenance people, those requirements, some emergency duties for them, and any fire safety and evacuation instructions. Again, if you think of the last time you stayed at a hotel, inside the back of the door in your hotel room, there's a list of stuff that, a map, there's going to be a diagram of the floor you're on, and typically a list of instructions. If the alarm sounds, you do this, you do this, you do this. R2, just some requirements for emergency guides to show, how the building's laid out, the evacuation plan, and how all that's to be conducted. And then for R4, same as I-1, except the residents do participate. So remember, the I-1 drills, the occupants don't necessarily have to participate in the drills. For R4 occupancies, they do. We're almost done. For covered mall buildings, so if you think of shopping malls and things like that, special requirements, they have to submit a lease plan for all the occupants in the building so you can keep track of who's there and who's gone. Tenant identification on the outside of a building, so if you ever drive around any of the shopping malls, you should notice on the outside doors that go into the individual tenant spaces, they should each be identified, whether by a unit number or a name. There should be some tenant identification on the outside of the building. And then identification of unoccupied tenant spaces. So what places are vacant inside the building. Anybody know who's responsible for designating the appropriate location for tornado shelters in schools?
Principal?
So whoever's in charge of that individual school, the principal of the school is actually the person that's in charge for tornado shelters and identifying where they go. Obviously, there's language and some direction in the fire code on preferred locations for shelters and, interior, hallways, no windows, away from certain areas of the building. So we can provide guidance to the schools, but ultimately it's the principal's decision on where those kids evacuate and shelter. Like it says there's standards for shelter designation, where it should be, and some general considerations in the fire code that help us identify it. You're not going to put it, in the front atrium of the school with the glass from floor to ceiling kind of thing. That's in the fire code. You might have any questions about chapter 4? Silence. So I'll just kind of review or in summary, just keep in mind that, like I said, chapter 4 is unique from all the other chapters in the fire code because it deals with human behavior and what people have to do. All the other stuff in theory should be automatic. So if they have a sprinkler system, chapter 9 in the fire code requires a sprinkler system in a building. The sprinkler system should operate the way that it's designed, and obviously there's maintenance and stuff that goes along with that, but they typically don't take human action to do anything. Same thing with the fire alarms, building construction. When I build a fire separation or put a fire door in, it is what it is, and the fire code tells you, how the building has to be built. Chapter 4 deals with how the people are supposed to react inside the building, so that's a little bit unique. And we have a lot of, I'll say, authority and options with some of the larger events and even smaller events, but kind of requiring or working with, working with the business owners to develop the plans so that if something were to ever happen, at least we're in the best position to take care of it. So if nobody has any questions, then we'll wrap it up. If you would, those of you that are online, because I can't see everybody at once on the screen, and I'm not completely Zoom savvy, and my mouse isn't working on my computer. If you could shoot me an email, you could just reply to the one I sent out with the Zoom link that you watched the video, then I'll send you the certificate, and we'll be good to go. That's all I got. Yeah. That's why I was trying my.
So we can log it.
So Jason was on. Reichert.
Mike.
Like, I don't know who iPad 2 is. I think that's McCain. Maybe.
Sure.